Well, it's my honor and privilege to introduce our next panelists. We've just had now two great conversations, important conversations. We hope that they continue after these panels, and we're moving into a third panel. I wanted to address one of the questions during Q&A, which I think was a great question. It was about civil discord and the range of topics that we could be talking about. And you'll notice on our program, there is a theme that's woven throughout, and the theme was not decided upon in advance. We asked faculty members at the university to suggest ideas and to suggest panelists, and so we put together these panels, then realized as we were doing it that they were all connected in a way. And I think it's a great idea. I hope this looks like a successful event, that we'll be able to do this again. And when we do it again, that we can pick up other themes that we can talk about and we can discuss and we can highlight. But for these themes, we have a related question in our second panel. And it's the question of the true founding of the United States. And the way that we framed it is whether the true founding year of the United States is 1776 or 1619. And this, as a question, really arose in popular culture with the 1619 Project, published by the New York Times, and discussions leading into it. And I was struck as I was thinking about this in the discussion in the last panel that, of course, is prior to 2020. And so this is something that we've been thinking about. And for our panel today, we have Adam Seagrave and Stephanie Shonekan. They are former colleagues of mine from the University of Missouri before I came to the University of Texas. Stephanie's now the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland. Adam is an associate professor, soon to be full professor, we hope, at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. And they have a unique story. And so I want to invite them to talk about how they got to know each other, the collaborative work that they're doing. They have a book that was just recently published that they co-authored called Race in the American Story. And that book goes back to a set of conversations that they had in response to some campus questions and initiatives, all related to the themes of our panel today. And so I want to invite them to talk about the book and then to each give an answer to this question, hopefully as strong and succinctly and straightforwardly as possible, but really trying to figure out where the rub is on this question. What is the true founding year of the United States?
Okay. All right, so thank you so much for having us. We thought we would start with sort of the making of the Race in the American Story project, because we think it is a great example of how we model for our students on campuses, how to have engaged, sustainable, generative conversations around really difficult topics. So as Justin said, we all met at the University of Missouri, and in 2015, we had a major student uprising. It was right after the Mike Brown murder in St. Louis, and it was around the time that many of our Black students were walking around on campus, being called the N-word. Someone drew a swastika in feces on one of the dorm room walls, and it was just one event after another. And so students rose up. There was a hunger strike. The football players were involved, said they wouldn't play. I don't know if you all remember this. It was all over the news. And because it's the SEC and football, things had to happen. And so the president and the chancellor stepped down. At the time, I was chair of the Department of Black Studies, and Adam was one of the affiliate faculty. He was in political science and was also part of a center on constitutional democracy. And he had taught classes in African American politics, and so he had just arrived on campus right after this happened. As chair of Black Studies, I was asked to come up with a DEI program, John, that oriented students to what our values are at the University of Missouri. And of course, you know, there are all kinds of programs that we could have bought. It could have been an online program where students go in and take a multiple choice test and test out of it and so on. But our students said no. Our Black and white students and all of our students said, we want something more. So I'm an ethnomusicologist, so I decided to use music to engage that conversation. Sure, there's some places that we're talking about white privilege and microaggressions and things like that, which the kid from a rural town in Missouri does not want to engage with. So we thought, why don't we bring up a Bob Dylan song that they and their parents love and talk about these questions that are still blowing in the wind. And so that became our program. I was very proud of it. I'm still very proud of it. And we called it Citizenship at Mizzou, because who doesn't like the concept of citizenship? It was a two-hour program that all students had to come through. And we listened to live music and had really great conversation. Students assessed it and said it was good, but not good enough. 2 hours is not enough to dig deep into why these questions are still blowing in the wind. So Adam came to me and said, let's start a class. Let's really pull it out and have a semester-long engagement. And this would not be mandatory like citizenship at Mizzou, but it would be a chance for students to opt in to a longer engagement. And the first semester, we had 5 sections, they all filled. And so we knew we were on to something. And so that became a class, that became a project that we both took to our various new campuses. And that class is still being taught at Mizzou and is being taught everywhere, at a lot of places around this country and elsewhere. Want to say more on that?
No, I think that was
maybe?
yeah. So building off of this project that Stephanie just described, we decided to write a book that reflected on our experiences in creating the course collaboratively and on the project, and how it went, and then also how our personal journeys led us to that moment. Because Stephanie and I have very different backgrounds, very different personal stories, come from very different places, and have different opinions about things. So the book explores all of those different opinions and the relevance of our personal backgrounds and where we found common ground. So I think our collaboration is a great example of that, of being different people with very different opinions, with disagreements, but who have common ground, who wanted to explore that common ground in order to improve the life of our campus, the life of our students, and hopefully our country.
I'll just say one thing about the course, which I had the opportunity to teach when I was at the University of Missouri. Also, we put together a set of shared primary source documents. Mm-hmm. And so what it was an opportunity for students to read primary source documents related to the question of race in the American story. And because it was put together in this collaborative way, you ended up with documents that, if it were just one person putting together the syllabus, you wouldn't have gotten the full breadth of views that are represented in it. And so having different people collaborating together on the things they think should be centered and they think should be read and they think are influential, it gave all of us new things to read and to discuss with our students. And so it was really a good experience for me as a teacher to be able to do that with the students. So the central question of the panel is 1619 or 1776. And what I want to do is give you a chance to give your answer to that question, and then explore what the implications are for how we answer that question, what perhaps the ideological background, our own personal backgrounds are that go into how we answer that question, and all of the various facets that we can go from there. But first, 1619 or 1776.
I can start. So in my view, to put it succinctly, 1619 as a narrative finds an important part of its significance in the ideals of 1776. And so to illustrate that, I'd like to use a river metaphor, which, as Stephanie knows, I'm very fond of these river metaphors. So I think of the ideals of 1776 as expressed in the most famous instance in the Declaration of Independence as like a river flowing perennially through American history and in some way through human history, I think. And like the waters of a river, I think those ideals of 1776 are not owned by anybody, and they don't belong to anybody. So that's the first thing I want to dispel about 1776 and what it represents is that it didn't belong to Thomas Jefferson. So I think somebody needs to fact check Jefferson's tombstone, where he says that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. That actually is not strictly true. The Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 people by the Second Continental Congress. As Jefferson said later, it represented the American mind and wasn't his own original ideas. So I think the first thing to do in appreciating what 1776 represents is to dissociate it from Thomas Jefferson, from the other framers and signers who led lives and did things that we today think were very problematic, very unjust, and participated in the practice of slavery. So that's the first point. And then I think what the 1619 Project and the narrative that flowed from it did quite well was to show how Black Americans have sort of opened the floodgates of that river in American history, the river of the ideals of 1776. Jefferson and the American founders, they dug a little trench, connected to the river to water the fields of their people like them, right, themselves and people like them. But later in American history, Black Americans have been instrumental in irrigating our entire nation with the waters of the ideals of 1776. And so I'll raise just a passage from W.E.B. Du Bois, where he says in The Souls of Black Folk, written around the turn of the 20th century, that there are no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than African Americans. And I think he's right about that the civil rights movement at his time and later was profoundly influenced by and drew upon the ideals of 1776, the very same ones that Jefferson had drawn upon when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So for that reason and others, I think 1776 has a really fundamental and foundational place as we think about what our founding year is and how we define American identity.
Okay, so he's riding with 1776. I will, of course, ride with 1619. So I want to answer the question in 4 parts very quickly. Number one is when we think about a nation's ideals, this idea that we are created equal, all of us are created equal, we have these inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We should ask ourselves, which is the group, who are the people that have fought harder than anyone else to achieve those ideals? Who has been the group to test and insist that those are the ideals indeed that were brought to us in 1776, but that have asked us to figure out how to perfect them? It has been Black people. Black people have moved for freedom, equality, and those kinds of movements have influenced other movements in this country, other movements that have affected the equal rights of women, of labor rights, rights of immigrants, and the LGBTQ community. Those rights have been inspired by Black people, and other movements around the world were also inspired by what Black people have done in this country. So we need to look back at when Black people arrived, and they arrived in 1619, the first group, and all historians will agree that the first large group of African Americans between 20 and 30 arrived and were dropped off by a ship called the White Lion at a place called, ironically, Point Comfort in Virginia. That was in 1619, and that is when we start thinking about and grappling with this idea of slavery based on racism and based on race. So we have to look at 1619 as a starting point for when this nation started to really live up to the ideals that it would then set on paper in 1776. Secondly, why do we always have to think of founding or naming things from the perspective of only one group? As you can tell, I'm not from this country. I have an accent, as you can tell. I'm from Nigeria and the West Indies. So as I think about my father's folks and my mother's folks, my father's folks are Nigerian, and the whole concept of Nigeria was forged during the Berlin Conference, and then afterwards, the name of the country was offered by the governor from England who came to Nigeria and decided that it would be called Nigeria. Now, fun fact, actually the name of the country was forged by looking at a river that was named by an explorer from Scotland who named the river Niger. Other fun fact is that Lord Lugard, who termed the country Nigeria, it was his girlfriend who actually said, let's call it Nigeria, but her name is nowhere. So it's a little side story about the erosion of even women and what they have done. My name is Stephanie. Ridiculous, right? But it is on my birth certificate. Who gets to name things? What is the power of naming things? And the people who name things are the people in power. Thirdly, on music, as I said, I study music, and if we were to ask who's the king of rock and roll, we would say Elvis Presley. Untrue, right? So let's rethink what the founding dates and the founding roots are. Elvis Presley is not the king of rock and roll, although in general discourse he is. Who's the king of swing? Benny Goodman. Again, eroding and erasing the influence of people like King Oliver and Louis Armstrong. Again, 1776 or 1619. Let's rethink how we name things and what the roots are. And then finally, when we think about history, we should think about how the 1776 narrative is important, but it shouldn't be the only narrative. That if we hadn't had Black people, who again arrived in 1619, fight for the ideals that we now are so proud of, we wouldn't have a stage right now where I get to sit between these two guys and become a part of the conversation on campuses like this. So for those reasons, I think that we should look at 1619 as the founding of the United States.
I hear you both say something quite similar, which is that the founding ideals of the country were in large part realized through the efforts of African Americans, and a central piece of that story is bound up with the civil rights movement. And yet, there's still this difference of emphasis. And so you say the same basic thing, but Adam, you're saying 1776 is the founding year of the United States, and Stephanie, you're saying 1619. And I wonder if part of it is a question of interpretive choices. So you're looking at the same set of facts. You're, I think, largely agreed on the history. And then the question is, which do you emphasize in an interpretation? And so I want to talk a little bit about what goes into that interpretive choice and what's the implication of it. On the one hand, are you emphasizing the true character of the United States as being bound up with these ideals, as opposed to being bound up with their opposite in the institution of race-based chattel slavery? And what goes into how we understand the character of the United States, the nature of the country today, and the reason why we make one choice over another?
So, okay. Yeah, I guess I would say it's a great question. So there are a couple of ways of understanding, I think, the 1619 Project narrative. And so one is I think, as Stephanie well described, bringing to light parts of American history and histories and stories and contributions by Black Americans that had previously been ignored or neglected and unknown by most Americans. So there's that part of it. And then I think, though, in the popular culture and in the commentary on the 1619 Project, the 1619 narrative also became something else, which was, to some extent, a repudiation of 1776. And that, of course, was contributed to by the editor's introduction to the project, which is somewhat out of step, in my view, with many of the other articles in the magazine. But framing it in terms of an either-or, right? It's either 1619 or 1776. And I think the ideals of 1776 have actually been waning for some time in American history. And so I think that was a dangerous moment, potentially, when the 1619 Project viewed itself or presented itself as repudiating the ideals of 1776. So I think there are two kind of different ways of looking at the 1619 Project there. But I think you're right that it's not a matter of disagreeing on historical facts. I think there's a lot of agreement there. The one historical fact that was problematic in Nicole Hannah-Jones's introductory essay was retracted, the claim that most of the American founders were fighting to protect slavery. That historical claim she later retracted. But other than that, I think it is a matter of interpretation and how do we view ourselves as Americans, right? What does it mean to be an American? What is American identity?
Yeah, and I think so much of it is perspective. I think if we stay with 1776, which has been the predominant story up to this point, we need to ask ourselves how that is working for us right now. When there are states that are asking us to remove the teaching of slavery from K-12 and even from university campuses. As we know, Alabama has just, they're in the midst of or have already passed a law that would prohibit the teaching of what they call divisive content, which is so ambiguous. Because what does that even mean? I have a son who rides with the LA Lakers all the way, and his best buddy is a Boston Celtics fan. So is that now something that we will outlaw, right? So if the Alabama legislation would come forth and say exactly what is the divisive content. It will be Black history. It will be African American arrivals and slavery. And so, if we could go back and say, let's focus on 1619 and use that as a starting point, there would be no ambiguity there. We wouldn't get to a stage where we have entire states trying to erode or erase that history. It could be a really good experiment if we were to do that. So I do think it's about perspective, it's about interpretation, and perspective is very much about the people who write it, right? So we've had historians of every race look at slavery and American history wonderfully. The ones that have really pushed in fields like Black studies have been people who have focused on specifically on Black history, and they're people from, again, every hue. If we were to go back and use 1619 as the starting point, I think that we would be at a different stage in our national discourse on race right now.
Well, I wonder if part of the problem has been that 1776 has been viewed, especially recently, especially I think post 2020, but as the product of white Americans, right? It is the white version of history, white narrative of American history, whereas 1619 is the Black narrative of American history. And I think that's partly why we see this legislation coming up of banning the teaching of slavery and other so-called divisive concepts in schools, is that white Americans feel threatened by this because it threatens their white 1776 narrative of American history. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I don't think 1776 is correctly interpreted as I said, as the product of white Americans at the time. I think that, and I think similarly, that 1619 is not only Black history. I think it's American history. I think that we all should know and incorporate into a fuller American story. So I think that's part of the origin of some of this conflict. But that really there's room for both narratives, and that 1776 has recently been has been portrayed as the enemy of 1619 of Black Americans in the way that it shouldn't be.
There's something in all of this that seems to be bound up with the question of patriotism. And I think that's probably part of what's going on in the curriculum wars. It's part of the interpretive choice about how to tell the story. And I can imagine one way of telling the story with the same set of facts where it becomes a celebration of the accomplishments in the United States. And so you begin from one point, and you have something happens in the world between 1619 and 1776 that accounts for the ideals in the Declaration of Independence. And I think those ideals are not there and not widespread in 1619. And so you're accounting for what happened, what's unique about the United States in 1776. And then the narrative from there looks like a celebration in some ways, not that you're naive about the history, but that you see it as a kind of overcoming of ancient evils that had always been there. And that's kind of one way to tell the story, where you have the same set of facts, but it engenders a kind of love of country, a love of one's own. And there's another way to tell the story, and it's one in which you see the United States as implicit or complicit in this ancient evil and a perpetuator of it, and never quite overcoming it. And that becomes this kind of question of the character. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the narrative and how we tell it and its relationship to patriotism. And I'll preface it with two aspects of Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay, which I think are interesting aspects. The very first line in her essay is, "My dad always flew an American flag in our front yard." And then when you get to the end of the essay, the very last line is, "But it was by virtue of our bondage that we became the most American of all." And so she's already thinking about this question of how we tell this story and how it relates to patriotism.
So I love this notion of patriotism because it is so bound up in questions of race and racism. And I think we try to ignore that. So we can go back to, I can't remember what year it was, but it was in the last 10 years when Colin Kaepernick took a knee. And that was, he was lambasted as someone who was disrespectful of the flag, the same flag that Nicole Hannah-Jones's dad had in their front yard throughout her childhood. And Kaepernick and people who understood what he was doing kept saying, no, it's because I want this country to be better, right? It was a very patriotic act, but it was always read a different way perhaps because he was Black, and because he had, you know, the very big afro, and always took that knee during the Star Spangled Banner, which again is another thing that we could talk about in terms of patriotism. And I remember when the 45th president said that, you know, get those. I can't remember the exact words, but you can imagine what he said about Kaepernick and other athletes who were taking a knee at the time. There's a way that patriotism by Black people is read in a different way than patriotism by others. And I think that reminds us how much race is part of this conversation. Why can't Black people say we want this country to live up to its ideals and do better? And whether that's taking a knee or critiquing the police or the prison industrial complex, all of that is, in my mind, acts of patriotism that are vilified by certain aspects of this country.
Yeah, I think that the patriotism question is a really difficult one, and because I think that there's, you know, there's always, as individuals, right, as people, I think we always have, you know, who we have been and who we are, right, and then who we think we should be, right, and who we want to become. At least to some extent, I think we all have that thought. Those are often two different things, right? But I think also who we think we should be is part of who we are as well, right? It's not separate from who we are, and so I think the question of patriotism is similar to that question of how we, of self-esteem in a way, and then also of how we think of, say, family members who have faults and problems, but they're our family, and but I think it's important that patriotism be reflective, right? When we're talking about love of country, that it not be blind patriotism, and that there be something good about our country that we really should love and value. And I'm thinking of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he says that we should save the country in such a way as to make it worthy of the saving, right? Worthy of the saving. There might be some countries that aren't worthy of saving. What is it that makes America, the United States, worthy of saving? And so I think it's important to identify that and to have that be the grounds for patriotism rather than a sort of blind devotion or something that, you know, that really doesn't leave room for criticism, right? If you're blindly devoted to something or religiously devoted to something, you can't handle criticism very well. So it has to be reflective, but I do think patriotism is very important. And I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones does a really good job of reflecting on that in that essay of what patriotism means to her.
I want to ask one last question about truth, and then open it up for Q&A and get us somewhere back to our normal set schedule before lunchtime. The question of truth hovers over all of this. The Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay is prefaced, I think, by the editors, not by her, but as making the case that these founding ideals were false at the founding, but they became true over time. That seems like a weird way of framing it to my mind, because I'm thinking if they're false then, they're false now. Maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. But I want your take on, in what sense are they true? Or whether they are true, these ideals themselves. And then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. I think that, when the 1619 Project, when Nicole Hannah-Jones, the title says that they were false when they were written, I think the charitable interpretation is that she means that they were not applied, right? Not applied in practice. I think that the more potentially problematic interpretation would be that practice or concrete reality is all that there is. So if you're not practicing something, therefore it doesn't exist or it's not true, right? If you say all men are created equal, but you don't reflect that in practice, then all men are created equal must not be true. I don't know if she meant to actually imply that, but I do think that's a potentially dangerous position to I guess reject the idea that there are perennial or eternal truths, realities that exist independently of our practice and whether we think they're true or not. So I think that the truths of 1776, the self-evident truths, I think they are true. And I think they're true always and for everyone. But I think that's a different question than the question of whether they are always applied accurately.
I think they were true, but not truthful. I think the very notion of all men are created equal is questionable when Black women were raped on plantations, and it was legal. Like they had no recourse. They could not fight back because they were Black women. And so. And then we've got the 3/5 law and amendment, and then we've got the whole Jim Crow era. I think the ideals are ideals. They're wonderful across the world. Folks were looking at these ideals and creating their own constitutions and democracies based on the ideals that they saw, across the Atlantic, in the United States. So these are wonderful truths and ideals, but were the people who wrote them truthful? I'm unconvinced. But the thing about what I always say about the humanities and where we are now as a society is that there is not one big truth with a capital T. There are many, many truths. At the University of Maryland, we are grappling with what happened in the Middle East because of what is happening, because we have so many students who are Jewish and so many students who are Muslim. And then you hear how they want to think about the history of Israel. Do we start it in 1948 or before that? Or do we start it in October 7th of 2023, right? All of these are different points in the trajectory of the history of that region. And all of them are important, but you cannot take just one point or one truth and say that is the entire story. There's a much bigger context, and until we can look at all of those points and string them all together, we will continue having sometimes very uncivil discord on our campuses, unfortunately.
Well, thank you all for being with us. Thank you to our panelists.